Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight for our Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. We're going to hear, I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, so thanks again on behalf of my colleagues and our friends here at Greenspun College who, can you not hear me?
Is the mic on?
Hello? I'll just really shout, how's that? I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're here in Greenspun College, and as you can see, our colleagues here are helping us record the lecture tonight. We're going to have a talk on the search for an Asia-Pacific strategy. Where is the United States headed? A timely address, I believe, because I was just looking online at a few of the news stories in the last few minutes and hours with titles ranging from North Korea says it has a right to shoot down U.S. warplanes. North Korea vows to become a state nuclear force. North Korea has brought America and China closer. And Russia throws North Korea a lifeline to stymie regime change. Just a few of the stories in the media in the last few minutes and hours. So we are very pleased to have our colleague Johnathan Pollack with us to address that topic. He's been here this week and spoken to history classes, economics classes, met with individual students who have and faculty who have a research interest in this topic. Johnathan is the interim SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies in the Center for East Asian Policy Studies and a senior fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center of the Brookings Institution. So Brookings has satellite operations, not just in Las Vegas, but in other places of relevance. Prior to joining Brookings, he was a professor of Asian and Pacific Studies and chairman of the Strategic Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. And he also worked at the RAND Corporation. He has his master's and doctorate in political science from the University of Michigan. And I'm always thrilled to welcome a fellow Wolverine to campus. So I don't know if we have any Ohio State people in the audience, but oh no. You'll have to deal with them, John. And he has, of course, taught and published extensively on this topic. And so please join me in welcoming Johnathan.
Bill, thank you very, very much for the welcome. And one small correction, I am no longer the interim SK Korea Foundation Chair. We actually have a splendid new appointment that Brookings made in recent weeks that pleases me a great deal, since I thought very strongly that it was necessary to get somebody a little farther down in the age range who could take this position farther and longer than I could. Maybe this is someone who might come here in the future. She's absolutely first rate. Her name is Jung Pak, and it's a name you will hear more about. I'm delighted to be here. I know this is a very, very problematic week here in Las Vegas, to say the least, which one way or another, everyone here has to find a way to overcome and to understand. And I'm really struck by the contrast, of course, between the seeming serenity of this campus and knowing that not so far from here, unspeakable violence took place. And maybe in a small way, it's just a reminder of how much the world can be a very, very contingent and unexpected place. But certainly on behalf of all of Brookings, we feel very strongly and sadly about what has happened here, and convey our deep, deep sadness about this to all the people here at UNLV and beyond. Let me make at the outset a personal observation or two. I first began, about to date myself, I first began studying East Asia about 50 years ago, which kind of stunned me when I thought about that for a moment, because I'm not quite clear how I've gotten to be 70 years old, but let's not dwell on that. But the East Asia that I began with, that I first studied, and what we have today are barely recognizable. At the time, of course, we were still in the middle of the Vietnam War. China was this remote place that literally maybe a few dozen Americans had, if that many, had been to since 1949. And it was a much less developed Asia. At that time, of course, the one singular developing society in Asia was Japan, which had recovered from the war. So when I look back to where we were and to where we find ourselves today, it's really quite stunning. Some problems, to be sure, have persisted, and I'll talk about some of them. But I think by any measure, the United States and those who have shaped American policy in East Asia over the decades can look upon what has emerged here as, relatively speaking, a major success story for the United States in terms of the impact of globalization and prosperity, democratization in societies that previously did not know democratization, including, of course, Japan's post-war emergence, the ultimate advancement in democratization of both Taiwan and of South Korea, and selectively some of the states in Southeast Asia. And the ability, or so far, whether out of good fortune or what have you, to avoid, since the end of the Vietnam War, any kind of resumption of large-scale military conflict. A notable achievement. In fact, when you think about all the public attention that Bill has just referred to, devoted now to anxieties about what could come next in East Asia, I'm reminded by the fact that right now, at least at the moment, no one is dying in interstate war in East Asia. We'd like to keep it that way, even though there are all these threats to the peace. If you were to compare it to, let's say, the chaos and mayhem of the greater Middle East, or even the upheaval that we are seeing in East and Central Europe, given Mr. Putin's revanchist tendencies, relatively speaking, East Asia doesn't look so bad. If by that I mean simply that we are not in a war and we would like to keep it that way. So that's important to bear in mind. That's the good news. The more cautionary news, though, is that we could be on the cusp of potentially very, very disruptive change for a variety of reasons that I will enumerate. We may not be fully well prepared for many of these. Many of these reflect, I think, if you will, shifts in the tectonic plates of international politics, shifts, some that we might anticipate, some that we can't or have not understood well. And the question we have to ask ourselves is whether the United States today is well prepared for this transition. I think you can sense where I may be going. And that absent some sense of strategic coherence and creative engagement, the optimism that I express about where East Asia is today could be potentially at risk. I say this not being a dire pessimist. Quite the contrary, I'm not. And I often think, and the references were made to all the headlines in the newspapers, let's remember the old newspaper adage, if it bleeds, it leads. Those in the news business have an inherent reason to make things sound more stark and conflict-laden than they probably are, because it sells. My goal is much more to step back and look at the bigger risks that may underlie the newspaper headlines, more of the serious study that has to be done so we understand a variety of the trends and circumstances that we confront. And I'm going to name 5, and all of them require, I think, very, very careful attention. The first and most immediately are the dangers that we do see today on the Korean Peninsula emanating from the behavior of North Korea. And of course, I will come back to that, come back to all of them. Over the longer term, there are questions of the ascendance of China, or the reascendance of China as a world power, and the challenges that this could pose to the international system and to the United States. A third factor that I'll draw attention to is the role of heightened nationalism and rivalry that we see in East Asia. The fragility of some of the institutional arrangements, despite all the successes that we have seen over the last few decades, and therefore doubts about the viability of the regional order that the United States has been so centrally involved in. Fourth would be the question of the future of America's alliances. Unlike in NATO, there has never been a collective security structure in East Asia. We gave a stab at that in Southeast Asia in the 1950s, but it really was a very misbegotten exercise, and ultimately we cast it to one side. But if we turn our attention to these core alliances that define American interests in the Republic of Korea, in Japan, with Australia, these are keys. These are keys to our role in the region and the expectations that regional states have of the United States. All of these, though, are under, I think, the potential for great and growing stress. And last, and by no means least, the biggest independent variable of all is the current President of the United States. The election of Donald Trump and his priorities have the potential to push us in directions that I think are decidedly unhelpful to American interest, and yet they are propelled first and foremost by the forces in the United States that elected him president, and we'll come back to this. So if I look at the big picture, I think that the risks have rarely been greater. The question is whether or not the United States, working with others, will be equal to the tasks of a very, very different East Asian circumstance. Let's begin recognizing, of course, that the factor that has shaped so much of what we do has been war and war outcomes. If we look at the history since the end of World War II, we had, of course, the Pacific War and the way it ended, and all that that entails, and I'll come back to that. The problematic legacy, if you will, shaped by the end of the Pacific War. Then there was the question of the onset of the Korean War, and of course the larger Cold War process that so shaped our institutions and our involvements in the region. And finally, there was the war in Vietnam, recently reviewed in the Ken Burns series, which for those of us who remember that time well, remember just how unbelievably divisive and worse that it was to the United States, and we have to live with the consequences that follow from that. The experiences since the Vietnam War, as I said, of course, have been somewhat better, but what has been a problem for us in East Asia is historically, we've not been in our same, what I'd call a comfort zone. American leaders traditionally were more at home dealing with Europe. It was more familiar, it was known, it's where so many had, of course, migrated to the United States. Asia was different. Of course, the election of Barack Obama, who was, if you will, America's first Pacific president, changed the equation to some extent. But I would still argue that the region, for most Americans, still seems, despite all the interactions, the growth of economies across the Pacific, social interactions, the immigration to the United States of large numbers of Asians from a variety of countries, for many Americans, it's still not in what I might call our comfort zone. And it's important to bear this in mind as we look ahead. Despite all of this, the United States was a critical rule setter for the Asia-Pacific region. We were, if you will, as in the memorable expression from Dean Acheson's autobiography, we were present at the creation. I know that sounds kind of pretentious, but there was a lot of truth to it. And the question, though, is that now that we confront a very different East Asia, a much more empowered East Asia, states with ideas of their own, beliefs of their own, can we make that transition with them where we are still very, very relevant to the region, but on a very, very different basis than in the past? So with that as backdrop, let me turn to those 5 big issues that I mentioned at the outset. Let's begin with North Korea. this is one thing that is quite unchanging in many, many ways. North Korea is America's longest standing adversary in the international system. We have never had a sustained, productive relationship with North Korea. We fought, of course, a very tough war in Korea in the early 1950s. Of course, that was a war in which then the Kim regime was saved by the intervention of China. But that there are now, and I'll walk through some of the factors quickly, there are risks that the priorities, the strategies, and the directions of North Korea could lead us into perhaps the possibility of outright conflict, which would be a disaster, I am convinced, for American interests and for the interests of the region. War more by inadvertence and accident than by some kind of conscious design. I realize that flies in the face of much of what President Trump has intimated at various times, and we can come back to that. But I think it's important to at first embed ourselves in an understanding of North Korea. It is neither obscure nor unknowable in its history. I've written a lot about this history, and others have as well, but it is unique and distinctive in all kinds of ways. One of my professional colleagues wrote a book about North Korea about the same time that mine came out, and his was entitled The Impossible State. But the implication of impossibility is that it makes no sense. It just can't be there. And I suggested to the author, his name is Victor Cha, and he may or may not be our next ambassador to the Republic of Korea. I said, Victor, that's the wrong title. It's not the impossible state. It's the implausible state. Only a state embedded there at the center of what became the Cold War, of where successive generations of leaders from the Kim family, the only dynasty, by the way, in the history of the Marxist-Leninist world. Stalin never had a son to take over for him. If Mao ever had the idea that he would have a son to take over him, that was ended when his oldest son was killed in the early weeks of the Korean War. So here you have a dynastic system of deeply adversarial nationalism that has persisted through multiple generations of Kim. The realization of its nuclear capabilities, or partial realization of its nuclear capabilities, represent a fulfillment of aspirations and dreams that date from the earliest years of North Korea as a state. And I'm not pushing what I wrote about it, but it's all there in the documents and from interviews that I've undertaken. North Korea has gone diligently over long periods of time, even under periods of acute economic privation, to go from the building of an infrastructure that would enable movement towards a nuclear weapons capability to experimentation of one kind or another. And now, on an accelerated basis, under Kim Jong-un, the young new chief leader in the Kim family, making much more rapid progress than I would have thought possible several years ago. But it begs the issue, as he has doubled down. I know this is a city based on betting, so I look at Kim Jong-un, and he's made a lot of wagers. He's put a lot of skin in the game, and we can ask why, what he thinks this will enable his system to achieve, and there are questions here. But at one level, North Korea seeks some measure of validation that, very frankly, the United States and others deny them, believing somehow that if he possesses certain capabilities, or if he convinces us that he possesses certain capabilities, this will put somehow North Korea on a level playing field with the United States. Now, that's a very fanciful notion. I might note that today, the economy of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, is now about 35 to 40 times the size of the economy of North Korea. And so Kim somehow thinks because North Korea, through incredible persistence, having achieved the acquisition of these very distinctive weapons capabilities, that it levels the playing field. We have to make sure that we impart to them that it does not. That doesn't mean that we are on the cusp of a war. I know, again, and I'm not trying to beat up too much on the media, but we all, in the media and in a lot of deliberation, everything is posed as either or. It's the false choice of dichotomized thinking. So the arguments you will hear have to do with, well, our only alternatives now are either we go to war or we somehow accept their nuclear weapons. And that could not be more wrong. There is a wide range of activities in between that really define what I think ought to be how we approach and go ahead with respect to North Korea and its capabilities. But we could a little too easily fall prey to this kind of thinking that just kind of lapses into the idea that there are no alternatives whatsoever. It is not helped by the President of the United States, very obviously, but you can also see the contradictions within the Trump administration if you listen to what some of the other senior officials have to say. But this is a regime that from its origins has been built on the idea of external threat, real or imagined. It is the basis of North Korea's legitimacy in the sense that if North Korea argues that, you know, we are only doing these things to defend our own interests, to defend ourselves, to prevent American attack, it legitimates all the kind of misbegotten priorities that the Kim family, the Kim dynasty, has followed for so long. It's also, by the way, fraudulent history. If truly the concern is that absent a nuclear weapons capability, we would do to Kim Il-sung what we did to Colonel Gaddafi or to Saddam Hussein, the problem with that is that for 50 years after the signing of the Korean Armistice in 1953, North Korea had no nuclear weapons. For 50 years, we did not attack North Korea. We never even retaliated against North Korea for a variety of grievous things that they did: seizure of the USS Pueblo, the shootdown of the EC-121 aircraft, loss of 31 American lives early in 1969. There are a lot of reasons why we didn't retaliate, but what it suggests to me is that however unsatisfactory it may seem, the policy we have followed in Korea for a very long time has more or less worked, and it's called deterrence. It's imparting sufficiently to your adversary the costs and risks of any kind of outbreak of major hostilities. That does mean, of course, that North Korea has at different times tested, probed for what is permitted and what is not permitted. But I would note, even though this has been a policy that has required an enormous and sustained economic our military commitment to the Republic of Korea, where we still have about 30,000 US military personnel, it has not only kept the peace, but it has enabled the Republic of Korea, which as late as 1961 had a per capita gross domestic product of less than $100, okay? South Korea today is either the 10th or the 11th biggest economy in the world. Think of it. All of this has happened, if you will, under the gun, under these kinds of ongoing tensions. So deterrence has required major effort, and now we confront the reality where the possession of at least some measure of nuclear weapons capabilities in North Korea heightens the deterrence equation in all kinds of respects. It's got a nuclear dimension that is acute and will require, not unlike if you think about deterrence in the Cold War, very purposive long-term effort. Remember that George Kennan, in his classic containment strategy of 1947, did not expect immediate results with respect to the Soviet Union. It had to be purposive actions against to respond to Soviet provocations where they occurred, but to recognize that over time, the internal contradictions of the Soviet state would undermine it from within. Now, in the case of North Korea, there have been lots of predictions of the end of North Korea. And as I like to say, every day when I wake up and I turn on my laptop, they're still there. And there are many reasons why they are still there. And I don't want to say that they are necessarily praiseworthy, but they have persisted and survived on the basis of retaining autonomy from any outside power. Any outside power. They keep the outside world out. Because the biggest threat to North Korea would not be American weapons. The biggest threat to North Korea would be the presence, the sustained presence of foreign citizens within the boundaries of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. These could be South Korean citizens, they could be Americans, they could be Chinese, whatever. The reality is Kim Il-sung, the founding father of the Korean dynasty, and it is a dynasty, it's a Marxist-Leninist dynasty. In 1957, he told Mao Zedong he wanted the remaining Chinese forces withdrawn from the northern half of Korea. At that point, there were still perhaps as many as, I'm told, 400,000 Chinese military and economic personnel still in North Korea. Mao Zedong withdrew them in October of 1958, and there has been no significant, sustained foreign presence of any country in North Korea for 60 years. That's the secret of their success, and I use the term success advisedly. Keep the outside world out. Beg, borrow, and steal from the outside world in order to sustain your programs, but don't give anyone a voice within your political process. And that's worked. So now we see the acceleration of its weapons capabilities, and the United States must continue, in my view, to disabuse North Korea of any belief, any perception, any calculation that the existence of these capabilities erodes or will erode our commitment to remain on the Korean Peninsula, to sustain and to enhance the kinds of capacities and programs that we have followed for a very, very long time. Now, this is not going to be easy, and it will require, frankly, patience, which is something that patience and Donald Trump did not often come to mind as possibilities. But it is the question of the regime's viability over the longer term, without my being able to predict when, where, and how things might come to an end in North Korea. I'm not going to make that kind of a prediction because it's a fool's game. And we can't easily answer it, but over time, I believe that this is a society and a system that will confront increasing pressures. What we need to do is avoid talking ourselves into a needless confrontation. There are times that I think, and forgive my cynicism, that I think that President Trump and Kim Jong-un are both in on the joke. What Trump says totally validates Kim Jong-un, totally validates his desire to say, you see what he thinks of me? See what those Americans are going to do to us? It's a gift. And that's not a creative strategy at all. More to the point, we have to demonstrate our ability to continue to work with others on this issue, because there is no way the United States can deal with this unilaterally. To the degree that we try to do it unilaterally, or that we try to pressure others to do our bidding, it is only a guarantee of creating added space within which North Korea will be able to operate. And that's something we want to avoid. Anyhow, we can come back to North Korea if you have questions about it later. Let me turn now to China. You would think intuitively that concerns about China as a re-emergent great power ought to be very high on our list, and it is. But given the immediacy with which we look at North Korea as a potential source of a conflict. That's why I led with it, I think appropriately. But we do run a risk, I think, in sometimes of letting our Asia strategy be far too North Korea centric. If you really just stop and think about it, but we'll come back to that. But China represents a very, very different challenge, obviously. It has emerged or reemerged as a global economic power on a scale that we find hard to comprehend, though we need to recognize that, you know, one of the things with with China is China, of course, is a country of, give or take, about 1.4 billion people, so all the numbers are big in China. I understand that. But it has made, in absolute terms, and maybe also in relative terms, remarkable progress, especially since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, the way WTO provisions work is once you enter the WTO, there is in effect a 15-year transition period in which the presumption would be you would qualify for what is called market economy status on the presumption that your economic practices will be relatively reciprocal, relatively equal. You may go out, others may come in. There will be rules of the game that you follow, understanding, abiding by these kinds of principles that are there under WTO provisions. Without going into gory detail about it, because I'm very mindful of the time and I want to make sure I get through the other issues. I appreciate having that clock reminding me of where I am. I think the United States and others went into this process with a set of expectations about the kind of China we would see emanating from this process. We presumed it would be, over time, a more tolerant China, and it is, relatively speaking, still a more tolerant China, but it has evolved in ways, particularly under Xi Jinping, the current leader, that we did not anticipate, that find China closing some doors rather than opening them, making life far more difficult for those in Chinese universities, attacks on lawyers, attacks on non-government organizations, anything that is perceived as a threat to the hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party. So the contradiction here, obviously, is all of us know every day we deal with products that may not be of Chinese design, but they are manufactured or assembled in China. They are either our first or second biggest trading partner. They're the world's leading trading state. They're a powerhouse here. But they're making, or they're trying to make, a transition now away from their traditional model of economic development, which again, over this period of time, using lower labor costs, has enabled China to become just this factory for everything from the socks we wear to the iPhones that we play with all the time, and everything in between. But a recognition in China that their comparative advantage in a lot of product design has diminished because labor costs have gone up. China now has, because of these economic changes, generated a middle class. I'll throw a number at you. I don't want to say it's a refined number, but I would say, roughly speaking, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 million Chinese now enjoy what we would really call a true middle class existence, not dissimilar from what Americans may know. Freedom to travel, to live better, to eat better, to drive, all kinds of consequences that flow out from this internally. What has not happened, however, is that we have not seen China evolve in ways politically and otherwise that we bargained for. More to the point, as China assembles all this extraordinary, the results of its export strategies and our willingness and the willingness of others to buy from China, they have a lot of money. And we can grouse and grumble about it, but these are facts. This is a question of how we choose to go about our lives and how China has sought to respond. there's an old adage in a very renowned book by one of the great international relations thinkers, Hans Morgenthau, who defines the difference between a psychotic and a neurotic. And he says a psychotic thinks that 2 + 2 = 5. A neurotic knows that 2 + 2 = 4, but he's unhappy about it. And that's part of where we are with China. Can we accommodate to the reality of a very potent power, autonomous from the United States, yet dependent on the United States, and yet zealously protecting its sovereign prerogatives, that evolves into true great power status without this going trippingly down the usual path of rivalry and potential confrontation. Remember also that, if you look at the United States, U.S. policy towards China, it all depends a lot on who you're talking to. For some bureaucracies, having a big bad China, a China that I might also add is modernizing militarily, in terms of building things, not using them in active warfare. And if there's one thing we know, you only learn when you actually fight wars. And I'm not advocating, therefore, that China get involved in a few dust-ups to test some of their new equipment. But this leaves us, I think, with a sense of unease, even as we have gone to great lengths with the Chinese government, with a host of Chinese institutions, with the involvement of many American companies in China, who will often complain about the conditions under which they work, how they have to be overly generous with respect to technology transfer and the like, because the Chinese insist upon it, and saying, here's your Chinese partner. In other words, they're not able to operate in China in a way that they would like to be able to, in particular in sectors where China lags behind, because there are sectors that China really lags behind and where there is American comparative advantage. On the other hand, the Chinese are trying to develop over time, protect strategic industries, as they would call them, that would have autonomy of their own, so that at some future point, China would be presumably less dependent on some of the things that we can and do sell to China. A good example would be already automobiles, although there are some American cars that are very popular in the Chinese market. Over the longer run, there would be the question of the future of U.S. commercial aviation sales to China. Few countries matter more to Boeing than the future of Chinese aviation. They bought just staggering numbers of planes. But the Chinese have designs of their own, literal and figurative designs. They're not fully arrived yet, but the day may come where they have more autonomy in those kinds of areas. And so if you ask if we cannot establish and follow rules of the road with still a system that is party dominated, dominated by the Chinese Communist Party in ways that often can be very, very unhelpful or worse and troubling, then we're going to face a lot of problematic issues. You note, I'm not talking about a military conflict with China, although some would raise that possibility from time to time. I don't think we're going to war over misbegotten reefs and shoals in the South China Sea. And as I jokingly like to say, please forgive my sense of humor, but this is a problem that global warming will solve. You would just have to be patient. But there's an unease here about China as a major power and the rules it proposes to live by, and we'll have to come back to that. But can we avoid this kind of easy slide into confrontational relations and accept China, for better or for worse, as an autonomous major power? This is an issue with which we must still grapple. Okay, I've only gone through 2 issues, so let me speed through the other ones, not because they're less important, but because I'm running out of time. The third is nationalism. Nationalism, of course, can be a very positive force, but we see, even in countries with which the United States is closely affiliated, Japan would be a very good example, a lot of grievances grievances about unresolved history. In the case of Japan, even though the Japanese wish to present themselves as a very, very loyal ally, the Japanese believe that the post-war outcome was not legitimate in their eyes, under duress, in effect, because Japan surrendered unilaterally, or unconditionally rather, not unilaterally, and that in the American occupation, the American side wrote the Japanese Constitution. This was a matter of deep resentment to the grandfather of the current Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. His grandfather, Kishi, was actually almost put on trial for war crimes. He was arrested after the Japanese surrender, and he was deeply involved in the Japanese war effort. Kishi was released. He ultimately reinvented himself as a politician. He became a very big American ally on a basis of anti-communism, but always in the background was the idea of not liking the institutions, rules of the road that the United States had defined. And so Abe, his grandson, is trying to change this in all kinds of ways. Whether he's going to succeed or not of that is a different matter. It's not an easy sell within Japan. Korea, similarly, we have our close alliance relationship in the Republic of Korea. Their internal politics are often very, very divided. Korea often feels a bit of the victim, both of the Second World War and of Japanese colonialism, and then of the Cold War, because they are still divided between North and South, even though, frankly, a lot of South Koreans are not eager over the prospect if there ever could be Korean unification, given what it would cost. Be that as it may, we see these kinds of festering issues, which, frankly, with the Japanese, they often don't talk about that much publicly, but it's there. It's there for those of us who study and follow these issues. If there's one salutary effect to the North Korean nuclear crisis that we deal with right now, it is making Japan and South Korea, which are now led by very different kinds of politicians, Japan by a decidedly right-of-center prime minister, Korea by a left-of-center president, but they are recognizing that they face a common problem in North Korea, and it's giving them some kind of a basis on which they deal more credibly with one another, even though underlying it, the latent issues of difference there are very, very profound, and the United States is kind of caught in the middle of all of this. Okay, number 4 is not unrelated to number 3, but it's the question of the future of American alliances. Alliances, you could argue, are axiomatically driven by threat. That's where they have their origins. But can you redefine the purposes of alliances over time? Because countries like Japan, South Korea, in a different way Australia, they all have convictions and aspirations and fears of their own, and that we need to be mindful of. They seek credible relations with the United States, but underlying a lot of it is a desire for autonomy, more autonomy, that of course is propelled further by the last factor that I'm going to talk to, and that of course is the President of the United States. President Trump is a president like no other. What I described before about the record of American accomplishment in East Asia since the end of the Second World War has basically been shared in broad brush by every American president since, Republican or Democratic. Trump is different. We all know his issues of his temperament. I'm not here to dump on him, simply to describe him. Some of you may feel differently, I understand that. But he lacks, in my view, the temperament and the intellectual curiosity and the sheer knowledge to exercise in judicious, consistent fashion a long-term strategy. There are a lot of risks that this runs. He is viscerally opposed to multilateral trade agreements, even when these agreements are of demonstrable benefit to the United States. As soon as he was inaugurated, within days, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an exquisitely, endlessly negotiated multilateral trade agreement, including with partners of the United States that had long been recalcitrant and resistant to giving us the kind of market access that we wanted, including Japan, and also, interestingly enough, including Vietnam. So it wasn't only a question of market economies, but he pulled out unilaterally, much to the dismay of close American partners, including the Japanese. So he also, amidst this time where South Korea, above all, is under acute military threat from the North, he made a lot of noises about pulling out of the Korea-US joint trade agreement because, in his view, it disadvantaged the United States. He's dead wrong, dead wrong. He doesn't like trade imbalances, but I don't claim to be an economist, but trade imbalances are a natural phenomenon in the world. One country may have things that it does better than another country. This is David Ricardo, comparative advantage. This isn't rocket science. More to the point, it reflects deeper phenomena about when one country or another country gets its own fiscal house out of whack. We have been more than happy to go hugely into debt to feed our own needs. Years ago, I remember saying to someone that I'm really very un-American. I save money. You know, I mean, I think it's only prudent to do that. Although there are a lot of Americans who live obviously beyond their means. But Trump seemingly resisting globalization and its effects. I'm not trying to say that globalization has been a neutral phenomenon. A lot of people have not benefited under globalization, and that's actually in part what elected President Trump. But it's really his position, as described by Robert Zoellick, former head of the World Bank. His position is almost strategically incoherent, and it doesn't need to be, because the irony is, even as many countries in Asia want a fuller respect for who they are, the only country in Asia that wants the United States to go home is North Korea. So somehow, amidst all of this, there is a recognition that the United States, for all of our imperfections as a society and one thing or another, is absolutely critical to sustaining the peace and hopefully to building a revised order into which all can contribute. So the goals seem to me to be very clear. We need to keep the peace if we possibly can, not to find ourselves triggered into a needless war, to build a sustainable relationship with what we hope will ultimately be a more tolerant China, to transform our alliance relationships on a more equitable basis, and to sustain credible American leadership that neither hectors nor dominates and accords regional actors their legitimate due. Over the longer term, as we try to sustain a regional order, can we live with a region, a large, complicated, diverse region that has many ideas of its own? Can we adapt to the realities of regional actors who have every incentives to sustain close relations with the United States, but have their own ideas along the way? I regret to say that, again, that at present, the Trump phenomenon, has been very disquieting across East Asia. I know this from my travels. I know this from visitors. There is a perception of a diminished United States. We get into these daily catfights. Today, stunningly, Secretary of State Tillerson had to deny, he never denied that he called Donald Trump a moron. So take that for what it's worth. But this is not how a great power should conduct itself. The fact that there are countless numbers of positions that are vacant in the United States government. We don't have an ambassador in South Korea. His appointment, if it is Victor Cha, that's great. Victor's a very capable guy. I'm sure he would do a splendid job. It is October of 2017, and he hasn't even been announced. How do you impart credibility about your power and your purpose and your commitment with those kinds of priorities? So the question we have to ask is, are we witnessing simply a blip on the radar screen, or will the priorities that are underway do lasting damage to American interests as states, despite all their incentives to stay closer to the United States, begin to evolve strategies of their own that are less dependent on American power? I don't have an answer to that, but we had better look at that first and foremost. So that's where we are. I think I'll stop at that point. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions. And I'll take a drink of water.
Please.
I didn't want to stop, and
Thank you, sir, for
Thank
your
you.
thoughts on a complex topic. We do have time for probably a couple questions before I need to get Johnathan off. I will get to some people. I will encourage our students that I know are in the audience to ask. Usually I don't have to encourage students to ask a question, but yes, sir. Yeah, I know you're a student, so go right ahead.
North Korea is such a closed society. How do you obtain information about politics, economics, culture?
right. It is a very closed society, you're right. It's leakier than it used to be. There are some news bureaus there, although I'm not going to give them a lot of credence. And for example, Associated Press has a bureau there, but they don't have a continuous correspondent there. A lot of what we know about North Korea is derived from historical sources, archives from the Cold War, from the Soviet Union, and from Eastern Europe. I would be thrilled if the Chinese would begin to open up some of their archives too, not because of the airing of dirty laundry, but because it would add a whole nother dimension in our understanding. But North Korea also plays an interesting game with respect to its visibility, how it presents itself. It selectively, of course, doles out invitations for media. There have been a variety of American reporters there recently. You're absolutely correct. It's under very, very controlled circumstances. The challenge here actually is to sift through a lot of what we read about North Korea, some of which can be highly sensationalized and simply not accurate at all. And those are judgment calls. But it is a little more permeable than it used to be. I don't want to overstate it. If there's one thing where we're probably, well, we're very weak on understanding of their politics. That I understand for all the reasons that I've noted. I would wish that we had a better and more comprehensive feel for the actual state of their economy. North Korea depended hugely on the Soviet Union for subsidies. When the Soviet Union went out of business, it had devastating effects on North Korea, and their economy probably shrank by at least 1/4 or more. There was a grievous famine and the like. There is no famine right now. The North Koreans have made some headway there, but they're recovering very slowly from a low base. And frankly, what the United States and others are trying to do is to constrict their economic activities with the outside world precisely to clarify the choices that they face in terms of their priorities. So what we have to guard against is, you'll see they've got a jazzy new airport, although there are not a lot of planes flying in. There are high-rise buildings that have sprouted in Pyongyang. Whether they're all occupied or not is a different matter. The North Koreans, I would say, I will give them credit for this, they are extraordinarily clever and adept at finding ways to steal. They're just very, very good at it. They recently had a great success in a bank heist in Bangladesh, where I'm not quite sure the number, but maybe 80 million, 140 million, whatever it was. They're good at this. This is how they've gone about their business for a long time. They also renege on promises. I mean, a good example, for example, of how they have benefited from the outside world but not incurred cost to it is there is an Egyptian company called Orascom that provided North Korea, sold to North Korea more than 2 million cell phones, not phones with internet access, but phones that many in North Korea now use to communicate with one another. Orscom got stiffed. They cannot repatriate their profits. They are forced to sort of plow their profits into other endeavors in North Korea that benefit, of course, the ruling elites of North Korea, not the people of North Korea, the broader population, the peasant economy, and so forth. So we're given how restricted the access is to North Korea, you rely as best you can on reporters or some researchers who are able to get there, and it can be enormously insightful. So I can tell you, for example, that I read a report recently by a leading Japanese economist. He's not a big booster of North Korea. He's been there more than 50 times. And he reports that there's a lot of interesting activity in the peasant economy, a little more latitude that they have to produce, buy, and sell on their own. It's something. The real issue here, frankly, is if and when North Korea is able to begin to realize some kind of economic advancement, and that's a very open question whether they can, then the glaring contradictions and inequities will become much more apparent in North Korea between the average citizen, if you will, and the ruling elites in Pyongyang. Whether that triggers larger disruptive change or not, we don't know. But I just think we have to keep at it and find ways to learn. And very frankly, that's a dilemma. If we were there, we would learn more, but we don't want to legitimate this regime. So we're sort of stuck. The book I published some years ago about North Korea was entitled No Exit. Some people want me to do revised version, and that I would call dead end, if I get around to it.
Yes. Very, very, very interesting talk. Although I think one thing is I did grow up in the Midwest, and I won't tell you what happened to the town I grew up in, but I think that there has been a lot of impact due to changes.
Yes.
And I think trade imbalance has had an input on that. 60% of our trade imbalance is with China. I think that, and there was a recent negotiation, I know, with India about they wanted to make 50% there. China kind of has this 50% rule or more majority. I think that's something we should really look at here, possibly also including a minimum wage fine and a carbon fine. But anyway, even if it's not an important issue, which I don't agree with, but even if it isn't, what would you say we could reasonably try? I mean, not limit or restrict trade. I don't want to do that. But just try to see how things could be, particularly the major areas.
Sure. No, you raise a very legitimate concern, and some of this is driven by globalization, a lot of it by technology, as we know. A couple of points that I would make. I would advocate very strongly that we need much better real measures of what the terms of trade are. Let me give you an example of this. I said this to a class here today. One of the biggest factors in exports to the United States is from the country of Walmart. If you just look at Walmart, what it produces in the factories in China, but then when it comes across the pond, it is counted as a Chinese export to the United States. It's not. It's a Walmart export. Now, you could say, obviously, there are Chinese workers who are being paid in their factories. I'm told if you put those things in, the severity of the trade balance diminishes, but it doesn't trivialize it. It's still a massive figure. This is something that we bring up with the Chinese repeatedly. It's not an issue only for the Trump administration. In fact, ironically, if I look at a lot of what President Trump has said, some of his grievances about China are not dissimilar from what Obama said about China. The idea that China's got a thumb on the scale, that American firms and therefore American workers are disadvantaged. All of that is true. It's easy for me to say, and you're absolutely right, that I've got all these specialized skills, so My job is not at risk. Whereas there are people who have really suffered. And I think, very frankly, I think that this is why we need to make a major investment in the United States, independent of China, India, or anybody else, on how we revive and rebuild and sustain the American middle class that has taken such a brutal beating. I'm very heartened, and Bill and I were talking about this morning. Brookings has just named a new president this morning. He's actually been here in the past for Brookings Mountain West. It's General John Allen. We have hired a retired 4-star Marine, an enormously capable man, who will now be, as of November 1st, the new president of Brookings. He has identified as his lead priority in his tenure as president of Brookings the rebuilding of the American middle class. Not to ignore them. They've suffered. Their wages are stagnant or worse if they haven't. And let's accept the fact that we have just hideous inequality in our country. And very frankly, those are grievances that did propel Donald Trump to the presidency. So your points are very well taken. Let's begin at home, is what I'm really saying. If we object to what we see as China kind of tilting the scales, there are ways we can rebuild here, and ought to rebuild here in a serious way, to revive who we are. And we are still the world's biggest economy, the most productive economy. Let's make sure, to the maximum degree possible, that all Americans are able to benefit from that.
Thank you, sir. I always apologize for having to end the best part of our program, this Q&A, but I need to get...
What he really was saying is, I just talked too damn long.
I tried not to say that.
I heard that.
So, but we have to get our speaker to our next engagement. Thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another colleague from Brookings, Samantha Gross, who will be talking about the Paris Agreement and its future, if it happens to have one.
Yes, right. Yeah, so she's been very involved in all of this.
Hopefully she will talk to us, inform us about that. Thanks again for coming. I hope we see you in 2 weeks.
Great, thank you.
Just take your mic off.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.